Let me tell you, in a town as tough as New York, the sweet smell of success doesn't hang around too long. So when it does come through your door, you better let it in. It's a hell of a place, New York. With big lights come big dreams, big risks, but big glory. They call it the apple, and it's filled with the juices of both good and evil. It's a playground, a stage, a fantasy world, really. Make it in this town and you can shine like Lady Liberty. How sweet it is. Like the song says, you're a number one, top of the heap. But when your luck runs dry, watch out. That's when the nights grow long and the streets go cold. And when that juice turns sour, baby, it's more than your day that gets ruined. A New York minute. That's all it takes to go from the top of the heap to the bottom of the city dump.
City Dump, the story of the 1951 CCNY basketball scandal. Back in the 1940s, right after the war, New York was a two-sport town. There was baseball with the Giants in the Polo Grounds, the Dodgers in Brooklyn, and the incomparable Yankees winning pennant after pennant in the Bronx. And then there was basketball, college basketball, New York City's real game. On the streets of New York, people talked baseball. They lived basketball. And for a time, no one played the game better than a bunch of hometown boys from the City College of New York, CCNY. It was a peculiar mix, basketball and City College. City was an intellectual haven, the poor man's Harvard, identified more with providing a top-flight education than for fielding successful athletic teams.
The history of the school was so significant going back to the 1840s, the whole beauty of the campus, the old buildings. And I think the other thing was it suddenly was the first time for a lot of us, a Jewish kid like me from Brooklyn, dealing with blacks, dealing with Hispanics. My neighborhood was Italian and Jewish. And I really had the impression when I was 12, 13, 14 years old that that's all it was in the world. You were either Jewish or Italian. And we used to walk around the streets and meet another kid, and he'd be new in the neighborhood, say, "Are you Jewish? Are you Italian?" That was it.
My father used to talk about City College in terms that were reverential. City College was a refuge for most of us. Your parents' function at that time was to make things better for you than it was for them. They didn't have the opportunity to go to college, that's what they're going to do for you. And the only college you were going to be able to go to was City College. I mean, this was a unique kind of institution. This was a place that took you in no matter who you were, no matter where your ancestors came from, no matter what your ethnic background. If you could pass the test, they took you. We were dealing here with sons of immigrants and grandsons of slaves. And you grew up knowing that City College was your out.
The school was special, the student body was special, the environment was special, the sense of having to achieve was special, and the people on the team were also special because there were Jewish kids on the team, there were black kids on the team. The idea of a WASP being on the team was literally unheard of. So you were dealing with minorities who had to make it. So there was that kind of psychological as well as physical energy behind everything that the team did.
City College had historically been represented by very good quality basketball teams consisting of students who could pass the entrance exams to City College and who also liked to play basketball. We had a famous coach, Nat Holman.
He was a special kind of guy. He didn't talk like a New Yorker.
Teams should be ready for any situation as it arises by being able to diagnose opponents' play.
He didn't dress like a New Yorker. He was a very sophisticated gentleman. He seemed to be an English aristocrat. And there was always the question in my mind, what is he doing coaching a City College basketball team? But he was also New York. He was the cultivated side of New York, and he appreciated that these kids came out of nowhere, and that if they were to make it, he was the vehicle. He was going to help them.
Under Holman, City had been to the NCAA tournament in 1947, reaching the semifinals. Now his program was building towards something more.
The word started to circulate on the campus in the fall of '48. Hey, we've got some freshmen over there in that gym that are beating the varsity.
Bobby Sand, Holman's charismatic assistant coach, had convinced several of New York's top basketball stars to attend CCNY. Although some quietly questioned their academic credentials, by the 1949-50 season, Sand's recruits made up the bulk of Holman's exciting team.
What most identified the team was their ability to move the ball rapidly down court, to get an open shot, never to waste a shot, and to involve all 5 players on the court at the same time. Each of the players seemed to have a significant role. Irvin Dambrot, was a left-handed shooter, and it was important that once in a while, when they couldn't break through a tough defense, he could open it up from the outside with a couple of left-handed shots. Al Roth was the guy who kind of controlled the ball with Cohen, and the two of them were a great backcourt, and they were able to see the open man. Norm Major would come in, he would give them a spark for 5 or 8 or 10 minutes. He wasn't afraid to get his body roughed up under the boards, to dive, to move himself around. Floyd Lane was such a cool player, such a guy in control of himself on the court. Eddie Roman, the center, was very strong, very smart, never seemed to make a mistake on the court, always knew where to be, was always in the proper position. Eddie Warner probably was as good a basketball player as played at that time, kind of late 1940s Michael Jordan. He could jump, he could rebound, and he had magnificent control of his body. He was able to fly through the air, drive to the basket, and he was physically very strong. And this was really the essence of City College basketball. Give and go, keep the ball moving, go to the basket, hit the open man.
5 New York City boys representing New York City's college, playing quintessential New York City basketball.
It was a city style of play. It was a great deal of ball handling, playmaking, the weave on the outside, working off the pivot.
Pass, 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 run your offense. Pass, 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 bang, here's a shot.
In my mind, I see it as a ballet. I see it as Guys and Dolls. I see it as Nathan Detroit. It was quick, in your face, a tease to the left where you knew you were going to the right. It was a magnificent acting out of the culture of the city.
Ethnically diverse, but with similar backgrounds, CCNY's stars embodied New York. Like the students they went to school with and the fans who rooted for them, Roth, Roman, Warner, Dambrot, and Lane came from the same hard-scrabble neighborhoods that dotted the city's 5 boroughs.
They gave something of less than a mystical dimension to what it meant to be a great athlete. You could be there and you could think of DiMaggio, but DiMaggio was a god. Like Updike said, gods don't answer letters. You didn't expect that kind of identification.
The Yankees did it season after season after season, and it never got boring. But this was different. The Yankees were people from another planet. These were guys from my neighborhood.
These were your own sons, your own buddies. You saw them on the street, you saw them in the candy store, you saw them drinking malteds, you could talk to them, and they were the boys, they were part of the group. It was a big family.
The greatest schools in the country could come after Roman, come after Roth, come after Warner, the greatest ones in the country, they wouldn't win. They just wouldn't have won because life was at the Apple.
And you played with him. I played a number of times in Creston with Eddie Roman. You rooted for him as if you would root for a friend, a brother, not somebody who occupied a stature that was beyond what you can ever think to claim.
Early in the 1949-50 season, the New York Times wrote of CCNY, "They do things, these Beavers. They do them knowingly, and they do them well. So well that City won its first 5 games by large margins."
The basketball team represented a window on the world. The football team lost every game 59-0. We weren't much at sports, but in basketball we would kick butt.
After the new year, the winning continued. An upset of St. John's, the country's top team, propelled CCNY to its highest ranking of the season, 7th. As the Allagaroo, CCNY's original and distinctive battle cry, grew louder and stronger.
Allagaroo, garoo, garah, Allagaroo, garoo, garah, Allagaroo, 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 garoo, garah, with a lot of histrionics and leaping and jumping.
Midway through the season, the talented young Beavers were surprisingly the best team in the country's premier basketball city. And they had done it during an era when every school's goal was to play its final game in the world's most famous arena.
New York City, that's where basketball was king. People would go to the old Garden just to hang around the rotunda or the lobby, whatever you call the damn thing. And they just hang down there. The PA system be on, and it'd be saying, standing room only.
It was the indoor arena of America. Heck, we had 18,000 people at the Garden every single night in and night out. It was the hottest ticket in New York from early December until late March.
It was like a medieval fortress. You could have had the Lions and the Christians do battle there. With steep banks of stairs and pillars that obstructed your view.
Used to go up brown bag, 25 cents up the back, 3 games. I can remember looking at the other end of the Garden and the lights from lighting cigarettes. I always remember it was dark and you see all these cigarettes being lit.
One thing I always remember at the Garden as a kid is the cigar smoke for the moment, just billows of it all over the place. And you would look through that with the lights burning off the hardwood.
That's all that people talked about in the winter, was college basketball. The Knicks were just forgotten. The Knicks were shunted off to the 69th Regiment Armory. They played there every Saturday night because the Garden had college basketball doubleheaders.
750,000 people saw 41 college doubleheaders in the Garden last season.
We had doubleheaders at the Garden 2-3 times a week. City College was a nationally rated team. So was NYU. So was St. John's. So was Manhattan. So was LIU. So you had 5 schools in the city that were nationally ranked.
All these schools all played in the Garden, all had great teams, all New York City bred. We had enough basketball, we could have played just each other in New York City and sold out the Garden.
Kids growing up in the neighborhood rooted for different college teams. You were a St. John's fan. You were an NYU fan.
We fought over the Dodgers, Giants, and Yankees during the summer, and then we immediately turned our attention to fighting over City College, St. John's, NYU, LIU, and the significance of all those teams.
Then the teams outside of the New York City area wanted to come here. This was where you wanted to go, because this is where the NIT was, New York, and the crowds building, the losers going home, and the winners going on.
But for a time, the NIT, the country's most prestigious tournament, seemed out of CCNY's reach. City had struggled after its stirring start. A string of sloppy mid-season losses, including a curious defeat at the Garden against lowly Niagara, nearly finished the Beavers. But after beating local rivals NYU and Manhattan, City finished with a record of 17-5 and got its bid.
There were 4 seeded teams that got a bye in the first round, but there were 8 unseeded teams, and City College was one of the last to be invited and was one of the unseeded teams. Sports writers and the public at large did not expect them to go far.
This is Marty Glickman bringing you to Madison Square Garden, basketball capital of the world, where each year the greatest teams from the collegiate ranks battle for national honors.
In the first round, CCNY drew San Francisco, the previous year's NIT champs, and won easily, 65-46. Next was mighty Kentucky and its morally suspect coach, Adolph Rupp. At the time, the Wildcats were more than the country's third-ranked team. They were basketball royalty.
Kentucky was the New York Yankees, Joe Louis, and Notre Dame in football. They were the defending national champions. They were widely considered the greatest basketball team of all time.
Colonel Adolph Rupp brought one of his greatest Kentucky teams to the National Invitation Tournament in New York. They were the champions of the Southeastern Conference.
The Kentucky team looked so all-American, tall and magnificent athletes.
The Kentucky warm-up was the closest thing to a Roman legion I have ever seen. It was perfection. The way they moved the ball, it was absolute perfection. Now, at the other end, at the City College warm-up, you had anarchy. You had chaos. You had a bunch of guys freelancing, bouncing it, no fancy drill, nothing to impress you. And I remember some people sitting around me saying, you know, we're going to get killed. We're going to get killed.
The club they faced this night was made up of 10 kids from the streets and playgrounds of New York.
There certainly was a clash of cultures there.
Adolph Rupp, the coach of Kentucky, who had said publicly he would never have a black player on his team, represented the Southern tradition, the all-white tradition.
Adolph Rupp. Shortly after World War II, Adolph Rupp was coming into town. And coming into a town filled with Jews and about to play a basketball team filled with Jews. And Nat Holman, a Jew, aware of all of this and being very smart and playing psychology, said to the team before that game, you know, I think it would be a very good thing if you guys just try to shake their hands before, just kind of sportsmanlike. I watched as Floyd Lane put his hand out, and this tall, blonde, gorgeous giant turned away from Floyd, which is exactly what Holman wanted, to get Floyd very upset, to get all of the other players upset. And Floyd hissed out at the guy, "You gonna be picking cotton in the morning, man."
The City College team went out there with two missions. Number one, win the game. Number two, stuff it to Adolph Rupp.
It was no contest. Slow-footed and bewildered, Kentucky couldn't handle City's quickness. The final score was 89-50, the worst defeat ever handed to a Rupp-led Kentucky team, and the greatest triumph in the history of City College.
It was not a basketball game. It was a cultural war. It was a religious war. It was City College's way of saying, forgive me, but screw you, Adolph Rupp. We are also part of this country. It's not just yours, it's ours too. After Kentucky, anything was possible in the world. Anything was possible. Bring on Bradley.
Who cares what the odds are? The odds are for suckers. What you felt then was 5 street kids from New York, 3 Jews and 2 blacks, were about to whale the shit out of Middle America.
Eddie Warner that night was as spectacular a player as I have ever witnessed. Every muscle in his body was attuned to play spectacular basketball.
And the game was a thriller every second of the way, and I was up there in the balcony, and you're sweating, and you're screaming, and you're watching this thing, and you're saying to yourself, my God, if we win this thing, we are the NIT champions, and there's nothing bigger than that. And in the back of your mind, you say, well, maybe you'll get a day off from school tomorrow if this happens.
It happened. City's 69-61 win over Bradley was a momentous achievement. It also presented Holman and his players with a unique opportunity. In just 5 days, again in New York, the NCAA tournament would begin, and no team had ever won both events. Playing in the Garden, in front of its home fans, City won its first 2 games and again found Bradley waiting in the finals. Now CCNY was 1 win away from the double championship, and as Holman told his team in his pregame speech, 1 win away from immortality.
You're going out there tonight to play 1 game of basketball, just 1 game. But what you do in the next 2 hours will stay with you every day that you have left in your life.
Seeking revenge, Bradley played City much tougher than the NIT championship game. But the Beavers had just enough left to hold off the Braves and won 71-68.
That's it, as City wins and becomes the first team ever to make basketball's Grand Slam.
How many things do you have happen in your life up to that point that are really that important? It was the most important thing in our lives.
City had accomplished the impossible. Classes were canceled, and the team and its coach were the toast of the town.
When City College of New York won the basketball championship, there was just an outpouring of affection for the team, of course, and for its very brilliant coach, Nat Holman. So let's hear it, New York. Here is Nat Holman. Nat Holman, here he is. Nat, congratulations.
Everybody shared in the victory. All the kids around the schools. It wasn't a victory just for 10 or 12 guys that played it. It was for everybody.
They had played stickball. They had played punchball. They had played basketball when there was snow on the ground in the New York City parks. And now they were the best in the world. So the reflected glory meant so much to each of us.
This was a kind of vindication for us, for our parents, our ancestors, our way of life, for the streets of the Bronx and Brooklyn. It's not like they did it for us. It's that they were us and did it. You know, we did it. We can do any damn thing.
It was right that poor people could be given an opportunity for an education and an opportunity to demonstrate to everybody else in the country that people like us, blacks trying to make it, Jews trying to make it, could make it in America, that we were as good as anybody else. And that, to me, was and is America. It was a Sunday morning. I was driving in from my parents' home in Brooklyn into Manhattan with my brother. We had the radio on, and we heard the news that 3 City College basketball players had been picked up. For what?
Following CCNY's championship season, Captains Erwin Dambrot and Joe Gallagher graduated. Without them, as well as Norm Major, City stumbled through several early season losses, including an unexpected pounding by visiting Missouri at the Garden. But that was just part of the story. In time, the team's troubles would multiply, perhaps symptomatic of the dark, mysterious, and Runyon-esque world of post-war New York.
People look back at it now and talk about it nostalgically as a very honorable time, but the mob was running the city in many ways.
They used to rate their neighborhoods by which gangsters had come from where. I'm from East New York. That's where Murder Incorporated was. Very proudly, like this was a badge of honor to have grown up.
And bookies were part of the neighborhood too. Betting was very, very well established in these neighborhoods.
To a certain extent, it was an allure to this underbelly, this quasi-criminal element. So really you were caught in between these solid brickwork, middle-class values and the other values that we find somehow outside, on the streets, in the neighborhoods, the schoolyards, the pool rooms. What a lot of us try to do is walk the fine line. So we'd go out and we'd be someplace we're not supposed to be, talking to people our parents wouldn't approve of, making bets, you know, $1 at a time or whatever. And then you go home, and now you're the nice Jewish boy from the Bronx and doing your homework and trying to get good grades and so forth.
At first, Basketball was just a small part of that betting scene. Then newspapers began printing point spreads.
When some teams came in from different parts of the country and didn't have a very good reputation as a basketball team, it wasn't enough to bet on who was going to win and lose, but by how much.
Until then, you couldn't get anyone to bet the game. If a powerhouse were playing a mediocre team, I mean, who wanted to bet the mediocre team? If you have the point spread, now you make them a 12-point, 15-point favorite. Every game becomes an even money proposition. So once you have the point spread, now gambling becomes very attractive.
It's called Madison Square Garden, and to locate it precisely, it's on 8th Avenue between 49th and 50th Streets, New York City. To identify it, well, you might begin by saying it's America's most famous sports arena, indeed the most famous in the world. But it's more than that.
Gamblers and bettors and hustlers and con men. I mean, that's who turned up at that garden night after night. And we knew about point spreads, and we knew it wasn't just to give the reader of a newspaper an idea of who the favorite team was.
By making the games bigger and bigger, they drew the attention of gamblers as honey draws flies.
When I'd go into the garden to broadcast those doubleheaders, around me, all I could hear was, what's the price? Has it moved up? Has it come down? I used to do ball games where the price might be $18.20. The crowd around me, with 20 seconds to go or 15 seconds to go, is uproarious. And the place was a bedlam.
Teams had the ball and wasn't shooting, and people were saying, shoot, shoot!
With only minutes left to play, one of the backcourt men threw a pass into a man cutting to the basket, and the ball eluded the man by an inch or two, just barely. The ball turns over to the team that was trailing. A guy down front yells out in a voice you could hear throughout the entire Madison Square Garden, "Stupid Eddie, what the hell are you doing? You're already 4 under the spread." The garden erupted in laughter. There wasn't any doubt in anybody's mind what this guy meant. Everybody knew what he meant.
Yes, somebody always wins, and when somebody wins, somebody loses.
Now, once you have the point spread, it becomes possible to control the games.
That's where the racketeers, the fixers, came in and contacted some of the leaders on the teams, or the men who had contact with the fellows who played ball.
The sordid connection between gamblers and college basketball players could be traced back to the 1930s, when several players from different schools were caught shaving points in return for money. Rumors now persisted that the current players hadn't learned anything from the previous scandals. The writer Jimmy Cannon was even calling college basketball the slot machine of sports. It was enough to persuade authorities to take a closer look.
The office had been concerned about the possibility of corruption in college basketball. So towards the end of 1950, in December, we began an investigation. It was not long before the sports editor of the Journal American came in to see Frank Hogan, the district attorney, and gave him a very mild tip. It was just that Eddie Godd, a former LIU player, was suspect. I think those were his words, as a matter of fact. But what it did do, even though it was scanty, it was very significant, because we concentrated on Godd, and we then found that he was in contact with Tato Salazzo. Salazzo was a fellow who was in the jewelry business, and he loved to bet. And he bet $5,000 and $10,000 on a game. But he wasn't satisfied with the odds. He wanted a sure thing.
Salazzo's quest for his sure thing took him to an odd place for an Italian immigrant: the historically Jewish Catskill Mountains, with its resorts like Grossinger's, the Concord, and the Avon Lodge. For an entire generation of New York's middle and working class Jewish families, the cool mountain air of the Catskills was a welcome escape from the brutal New York summers.
Finding a Gentile in the mountains was like finding uranium in Pittsburgh. When you got to the mountains, that was the place where everybody felt like a king. And they would try to create activities in these hotels to keep the people in the hotel itself busy at being entertained. And nobody would go to a place without activities. But once when they got there, they hated activities. They just wanted to know that they have activities. As long as somebody else did it, they were happy. But if you bothered them, they wanted to punch you in the mouth. 9 o'clock in the morning was calisthenics right after breakfast. The boss would walk around saying, how come there's nobody doing calisthenics? When does an old Jew want to jump up and down 9 o'clock in the morning? Most of them were thanking God they're still living. The main Jewish activity in the Catskill Mountains was to say after dinner, I'm going for a walk. And when the Jew went for a walk, he felt like an athlete. But there was one guy named Lou Goldstein. He was an expert in an activity called Simon Says. Simon Says, put your hands up. Hurry up. I said put it down. And you put it down. Ha-ha. I didn't say Simon Says, you're out. He was a brilliant maneuver at catching you without saying Simon Says. You thought you had him beat, but nobody had him beat. Every Jew lost that contest to this man. Now, they used to have also tournaments between hotels, where one hotel would play the other as competition because they had to invent excuses to feel like it's entertainment. And one of the tournaments was always popular was basketball tournaments.
When winning those basketball tournaments began to take on added importance to the hotels, the top college players from around the country conveniently started showing up in the Catskills.
Some of the big hotels started recruiting players to play for their basketball teams. They would make $1,000, $1,200 for the season. Hired as waiters, but didn't often wait on tables. They were there to play basketball.
And they lived like cattle in cockamamie little bungalows, about 37 kids to one bungalow. If they had a bed, they were lucky, because if the bosses had a real bed, they would give it to a guest.
Among those recruits was Bob Cousy, who played for the Tamarack Lodge in the affectionately titled Borscht Belt Basketball League.
You would play one game a week at your hotel and one game a week at another hotel.
They were quite an attraction, and the courts were cement, outdoors, and enormous crowds would watch them. And there'd be betting.
In each hotel, they had a pool. So if you had 500 guests and each one put in $1, there'd be a $500 pool.
They really didn't go for point spreads, but they were going for total points, the last digit of the combined score.
What's the total score? Well, 140, 130. You put your dollar down, the guy who won or came the closest, or gal who won, they won the pot.
It was just a wonderful place if you were a really good, smart, professional gambler, because the minute you have people taking bets, you have people who want to control the outcome.
Somebody said to one of us, 163 would be a good number. Yeah, let's do it. We talked to each other on the bench. There were like 7 of us. And then, of course, we each got $100, so let's do it every week. What's the difference?
So you had guys like Salvatore Sollazzo working the Catskills, getting players to control the games up there.
Eddie Gard would drive around from resort to resort talking to these guys. He would drive Salvatore Sollazzo around from resort to resort trying to get close to these guys.
It seemed innocent enough, but when the players returned to New York in the fall, Gard was waiting, eager to take advantage of his summer friendships.
Sollazzo used Gard as an intermediary to sound out the players and to make deals with them.
He could arrange for a ball player to do less than his best. He could arrange for ball players to control the point spread. He could arrange for ball players to see that the score came out the way the gamblers, the way the racketeers wanted the score to come out, by talking to the guys. He could get the gamblers and the players together. He was the conduit.
When we started to concentrate on Gard and Sollazzo, we found these very close relationships with various of the college players. It then developed from that Gard was in frequent contact with City College players.
The names of Eddie Roman, Al Roth, and Ed Warner were now appearing in more places than just the box score, and the reason was Eddie Gard.
He was under a discreet surveillance as to his movements. If he drove, He was followed by detectives in a car, and we had also put in some wiretaps on the residences of a couple of the City College players. We tapped Sollazzo's business and residence telephones, and we found conversations between them talking about whether or not he had made a deal with the players and advising Sollazzo how he could bet that if they were favored, let's say by 8 points, Sollazzo could bet on them to go under the points. So the players were then supposed to shave the points.
Mike Canning, who sat on the wire, might be able to give you some ideas about the meets that were going on. I know there were meets, and Eddie Gard was in the meets.
We got in the car, we went up to Central Park, and we took a position of surveillance. We saw this man come into the park. So after he got in, maybe 50 feet ahead of us, we went in after him. So we watched him, and he went down a path, and he under a tree by a bench there, and eventually, a minute or two later, a young man looked like a basketball player, and they engaged in conversation for maybe 2-3 minutes. And something was passed. You could see their hands moving. And they got up and went their own way.
That something was Sollazzo's money. And while Gard's meetings with the gambler continued, so did City's games. And curiously, so did the losses. Despite its prodigious talent, CCNY was struggling.
There was something wrong.
Something's wrong. Something's wrong.
They were doing stupid things. That I never expected of a City College team.
Turnovers, passes astray, lapses on defense.
There were games that looked completely disoriented.
One of those games was in January against Arizona at the Garden, in which CCNY was a solid favorite.
There was nobody in my mind that knew what was going on the court, including Nat Holman, because Nat would turn to me periodically and say, "Why is he doing that?" Or, "Look what a stupid play that is." It was a situation where they weren't playing up to snuff. We spent a long time in practicing for this particular team, using this particular type of defense, and you got out on the court and you didn't do any of it. You abandoned everything.
I kept saying to myself, it can't be. It can't be that everybody is having a bad night at the same time. And at halftime, we'd scored 19 points, which is what we would do in the first 5 minutes of a game. I just couldn't believe that Eddie Roman, who was a very good shot from outside, would miss the backboard again and again, or miss the rim by a foot. I just could not believe what I was seeing.
But there it was in black and white for everyone to see. 20% shooting and just 38 points in a disgraceful loss. And then another odd performance without an injured Warner in a loss to Boston College. Something seemed to be rotten in the apple.
There's something going on here that doesn't make terribly much sense. What's the team doing? Is there something here that we don't know?
At that particular time, in the Bronx, a Manhattan College player, a star player there, Junius Kellogg, reported to his coach that he had been offered a bribe.
Students cheer Coach Ken Norton and player Junius Kellogg, who informed his coach when offered $1,000 to throw a recent game.
That offer came from one of Kellogg's former teammates, Hank Poppy.
After graduation, he came back to practice one night, sat around the gym, and then came over to the dormitory afterwards and approached me. And he says, "Hey, I hear you guys are playing DePaul Tuesday." He said they're supposed to win by X number of points. I said, I read the paper, yeah. So he said, you can make some money.
If our boys can be approached, they certainly must be approaching other boys throughout the country.
I knew that if someone approached you, that if you didn't report it, and it was found out later that you would lose your scholarship.
I can say that as far as that goes, any athlete in the country, in any college, would have done the same thing if he was for clean sports and clean living. Thank you.
Kellogg's courageous act led to the arrest of a gambling ring unrelated to Sollazzo and Gard, but to the underworld, a message had been delivered.
The news of the arrests in the Bronx and the news of Kellogg reporting this had a very definite effect on the reports I was getting from detectives who were tapping wires under court order. And that was that there was a concern immediately registered by Sollazzo and God and by players. This had a very definite freezing effect on fixing at that time, and therefore we determined not to wait any longer, but to move. We kept things under observation for a couple of more weeks, but then in mid-February we brought in Sollazzo and God, and we had the players observed on a game that they were playing in Philadelphia. We were ready to question them.
Abe Belsky and myself were sent out to Philadelphia to cover the Temple CCNY game. After the game, which CCNY won, they all marched down to the railroad station.
And as the train came to New York, when they got within the New York jurisdiction, in the tunnel leading to Manhattan,
Abe got a hold of Nat Holman and told him that we were detectives from the district attorney's office, and we'd like to take the men down to the office for questioning. So he got a hold of each one of them and said, wait for me on the platform right outside the car.
When we got off the train, there were 4 or 5 of us that were called together by Nat Holman. He had told us that these gentlemen, they were at the game, and they were from the district attorney's office, and they wanted to talk to you boys downtown. His statement was that if anything fishy has been going on and you guys were not involved in it, I would back you 100%. If there was something going on, then let the chips fall where they may.
I know he must have felt that somebody just kicked him in the stomach when they took his players away. As he walked away, his shoulders slumped, his coat collar was turned up, and he just disappeared into the dark on the platform, which was real dark.
We were brought down to the district attorney's office. It must have been like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and we didn't even get a chance to call our folks, and our folks all knew we were coming home. It's kind of scary, you know, we're 18-year-old kids, and everybody was put into separate rooms.
The questions were specific as to what their deals were.
Did we know certain people?
What they had agreed to do.
They told us that our phones were bugged.
At first they were quite reluctant, but then individually we would bring God in to confront them. When they saw God, that made a tremendous difference because they didn't know he was in the office too. And it was a shock. It had to be a shock. And it was the type of shock that made them unburden themselves. What are we talking about? Kid stuff? We're not. We're talking about criminality. We're talking about corruption.
Nadell was cleared, but it was learned that some of CCNY's biggest stars had disgraced their school. Through Eddie Gard and his gambling partner Salvatore Sollazzo, City College players Ed Warner, Al Roth, and Eddie Roman had shaved points in at least 3 games earlier in the season. Questionable losses to Arizona, Missouri, and Boston College were now easier to understand. In return for their efforts, the 3 players were paid a total close to $10,000, much of which remained unspent.
Captain called me over and he said, George, you're going up to Warner's grandmother's house, and we're going to pick up some evidence up there. We put him in a car, we drove up to Harlem. Warner went into a closet, and he took down a shoebox from a shelf. He took out a shoe, and inside the shoe was a roll of bills. It was a pathetic sight.
Scandal rocks the basketball world. Ed Roman seen making a basket, and Ed Warner making the next score were top aces of City College, last year's double tournament champions. The young men caught in this web of gambling intrigue presented a tragic scene.
We went to school on Monday. It was as if this great cloud of gloom had settled over the whole campus. People didn't know what to say. Most of us were stunned.
Complete shock. Absolute complete shock.
Tears came to my eyes. I couldn't believe it.
Those boys wouldn't do this to me.
It was awful.
I was thunderstruck.
This can't be the case. There must be a mistake.
It was no mistake. In fact, it would get worse. Less than a week later, the team's current captain, Floyd Lane, was also arrested. And then the unthinkable. The integrity of the championship team was shattered. Herbie Cohen admitted to shaving points during the 49-50 season. So did Norm Major and Erwin Dambrot. 3 regular season games were singled out: SMU, UCLA, and Niagara, all in which CCNY had been heavily favored. None of the tournament games were said to be fixed, but the damage had been done. The double championship had been tarnished.
I certainly wish that any young person who is tempted by easy money could have seen these stupid and dishonest athletes when they admitted their guilt. The entire business is loathsome, but it's also very pathetic. Sometimes I wonder what has happened to our moral values.
Because the players cooperated, the courts acted with leniency. Out of the guilty 7, 5 received suspended sentences. Al Roth was sentenced to 6 months, but got off by enlisting in the Army. Ed Warner would go to jail for half a year, but all would live with their mistakes forever.
Now here they were, they owned the world. And then all of a sudden, they're thugs. They're disgraced. From the very top to the very bottom, just like that.
It went beyond just the team. It went to everything we believed in. These guys weren't just winning, they were winning for goodness, they were winning for ethnic mixture, they were winning for the idea that poor kids can do well, and all of a sudden, the whole thing turned to dust.
This was the representative of the college, and that it should fail after having succeeded so magnificently was truly betrayal on a biblical level.
I didn't have that feeling again until Jack Kennedy was assassinated. Jack Kennedy was the first presidential candidate I voted for who won. And to have him be president for this short time and then taken away by an outside force was a terribly depressing thing, a horrible thing.
It would be incorrect to assume that this was just an item on the sports pages. This was a dramatic bomb that dropped in my neighborhood. There was a woman I knew from the neighborhood standing there with tears in her eyes, and she was crushed. She was really crushed. And I think that she spoke for a lot of people at that time. City College was not simply another of those schools. It represented something very important. And this was a moral breakdown, a humiliation for Jews, because City College was so connected with the notion of Jewish culture.
That was the last time that I really believed in pure idealism. For these guys to sell out their school, themselves, and their careers for $800, for $1,000, for $1,500 was just such an emotional blow. You never really recover from something like that, and is a wound in your psyche that lasts all of your life. When people just casually say, "Where did you go to college?" and I say, "CCNY," you can see a look on people's faces. They know my age, they know I probably was around at that time. It is a little bit of a burden for all of us to carry who were in school at that time.
In the months that followed, more players from other city schools were caught in the scandal's web. Long Island University was hit the hardest. 3 of its players were arrested, including its All-American center, Sherman White, who paid the heaviest price. Because he already had a petty juvenile record, White spent a year in prison, ending his professional dreams.
If there had been no scandals, the Knicks would have had a territorial choice in those years. If they had drafted Sherman White, I'm convinced that they would have beaten George Mikan's Lakers. The Knicks would have won 2, 3, 4 championships, maybe more. Sherman White would have been an all-star in the NBA, maybe the best player in the NBA.
The basketball scandal of 1951 was like the lancing of a boil. Corruption in sport wasn't new, but we had covered it over with Newt Rockne piety and Dick Merriwell sugar. And finally, when this whole big scandal came out, the lance the boil, out comes all the stuff.
Around the country, schools reacted with disgust at the news of the scandal. But their contempt would soon seem transparent. In July of '51, it was learned that corruption had even reached America's heartland, where the seduction of gambling proved too much for the vaunted braves of Bradley. Kentucky fell next, even though Rupp had piously claimed that no New York gambler could touch his boys with a 10-foot pole. The reality was the damage to college basketball could have been worse. For every school implicated, many were left untouched. And for every player who was banned from the NBA, others were welcomed, even though rumors had them just as dirty. In the end, many reputations were soiled, but CCNY's was ruined. No longer would City College play big-time college basketball. Its players had taken a bite from the forbidden fruit and got thrown out of the garden. They had gone from heaven to hell and took the city game right down there with them.
A lot of schools de-emphasized basketball. A lot of schools stayed away from Madison Square Garden. Madison Square Garden was no longer the Mecca. It was a place to be avoided. New York City high school kids started leaving the city and going to other schools because there was no place in New York for them to excel.
College basketball in New York City never recovered from the scandal. To this day, college basketball is not nearly what it used to be.
In the blink of an eye, Nats boys had gone from conquering heroes to fallen idols. But were they the only ones to blame?
I believe that these players were used. I believe personally they were had.
After the scandal broke, the search for answers began, and it soon became clear that some of the players never belonged at City College in the first place.
Some of those players were barely able to graduate from high school, and here they were playing for City College. Some players on the team who, when they got their exam booklets, the joke around school was that they would just write on it, "Regards from Nat," and hand it in.
Holman escaped formal blame, but he was still forced out as City's coach. After clearing his name, he returned a year later, but his stature was never the same. Maybe people were naive, but the reality was that college basketball was big business, and with big business came greed, and with greed came temptation, and with temptation came corruption. In a world filled with twisted morality and human frailty, perhaps the City College basketball scandal was inevitable.
A great deal of money was being made. I, as a broadcaster, made money. The newspapermen made money. The promoters at Madison Square Garden made money. The gamblers made or lost money, depending upon the outcome of the game. The only people who were not involved with dollars were the players, unless they fixed the game. So they were perhaps enticed.
I don't even think you got the $15 a month for laundry in those days. I mean, you didn't get anything. You had no scratch. You had no green. Let me tell you, when you got no green, green talks. And green talks loud. We don't want you to lose. We just want you to win by less points than the spread.
Make a few bucks. They're all making money off of you.
There are going to be some bad apples. There are going to be some good apples who are subjected to this kind of pressure and succumb to it. They're people.
As the psychoanalyst Willard Galen said, we are what we seem to be. And if you've done a dishonest thing, however we may explain it sociologically, it was a dishonest thing.
Made mistakes. There was bad judgment, but they were not evil people. You know, in a real sense, the scandal reflected the reality of New York because it was all there, the good and the bad thrown together. It is reaching for the apple when you're told not to go for the apple and biting into it when you know that it contained both the juices of good and evil.
In association with Black Canyon Productions, this has been a presentation of HBO Sports, the network of champions.